All right, I wanted to welcome everyone to this pasta demonstration. Due to circumstances going on in the world today with COVID-19, we are unable to meet face to face, but I wanted to give you an option to be able to take part in this demonstration from afar with the capabilities of Zoom. So thank you for joining us today in this demonstration. We'll be making pasta from scratch, so we'll be starting with just flour, mixing it into a dough, and then moving on through the steps that we would take for creating our final dish. We'll be making two different types of pasta today. We'll be doing pappardelle, which is a wide Tuscan noodle, as well as a filled cut pasta called agnolotti, which is a Piedmontese region filled pasta. Also translates to little pillows. So to start, we want to just make sure that we've wiped down our workspace. So I'm going to take a fresh towel, sanitizer, and just make sure we get it nice and wiped down. As well as any equipment we're going to use, we want to make sure that it's nice and clean. That when we pull it off the shelf, we can assume that it was put away clean, but it's hard to say. For as long as it maybe sat on the shelf, that it may have been contaminated by someone passing by, debris falling on it, physical contaminants, chemical contaminants. It's hard to say. You weren't watching that piece of equipment all day, every day, so it's safe to just wipe it all down. So I'm going to take a little disposable Seafold towel, dry off the surface. That way we don't add any extra moisture to our pasta as we're making it, as well as making sure our machine. Now when I wiped off the machine, I wiped off the outer surfaces of it. I did not want to wipe the rollers. If you get any moisture into the rollers, it could cause it to, build up debris as we use it, and we don't want that to happen. So we want to make sure we keep those nice and dry, but wipe off the outer surface where it may come in contact as well. So today we're making a basic egg yolk pasta. Utilizing two different types of flour. We will be using a 00 flour, which is an Italian white flour. Its gluten protein in the flour is very similar to that of all-purpose, a little bit stronger than all-purpose flour, but nonetheless it's not quite as strong as bread flour. And then we have about 25% of the formula is semolina flour. And semolina flour is a coarser ground durum wheat flour that has a stronger gluten protein in it, where it's going to give us more of a texture to our dough, but without making it too much of a bite. And we're just going to do a little blend. This blend is great for wider noodles and filled pastas because it's still a little bit more malleable. We can work with it a little bit easier. It doesn't dry out as quickly, and also gives it a nice texture in the finished product. So if I could get my ingredients from the cooler, it would be greatly appreciated. And I'm just going to go ahead and set up to mix this dough. And the way we're mixing it by hand today. We're going to be doing the well method. So I just want to blend my two flours together. I have about 170 grams of white flour and 55 grams of semolina. So on my tray here I have the egg yolks that we're going to be using. I separated them. I saved the whites. We're going to use these whites later in another production, maybe making a meringue. We can add it into a frittata. We can utilize it at a later time, as long as we keep it refrigerated and free of egg yolks. And I also have my sauce that we'll be using for our finished product, which is going to be the pappardelle with this braised short rib ragu that we made at an earlier time. So I'm going to have this out and start to temper. I'm going to get it into the saute pan and ready to go as soon as we're ready to make our finished product. Pull up a couple fresh towels just to have on the table with me to work. Excuse me. So I want to make a well in my flour. So that's to put my egg yolks. I may need a little bit of water to be able just to get the dough to the right consistency.
How many egg yolks are you using?
For this recipe, it's 9 egg yolks. Good question. Now, I'm choosing to do just egg yolks. You can use whole eggs, absolutely. The egg yolks give it a nice, rich flavor, add a nice fattiness to the dough, and it also gives it a really, really nice color, which is not 100% important, but the quality of the egg really translates into the quality of the pasta, right? All of our ingredients are going to play a part in the finished product to begin with. So I'm going to add about 30 grams of water, and I'm just going to do this by sight. And we can always add some more moisture in whenever we get going with our dough. If I feel that it's not quite the consistency I want, I can always come back and add some moisture in while we're mixing it, or just don't incorporate all the flour. And you'll see that once we get started here, mixing the dough up. So I just want to go ahead and I use a bowl scraper to get started with the mixing. I just kind of break up the yolks. If I were using whole eggs, I would probably use a fork or a whisk prior to putting it into the well, just to get it broken up, to get that white, the albumin, loosened up so that there's not big streaks of whites throughout our dough. With just the yolks, I don't have to worry too much about it. The water is going to have a nice effect to adding moisture to it. Now, do you think I would have to adjust the formula if I were to use egg white or the whole egg as opposed to just the yolk? Anyone have a thought there?
Yes, wouldn't you have to adjust the formula? Because if you're using the whole eggs, you're getting the whites and the yolks, and there's more moisture in it, more liquid than just the yolk.
Exactly. So if I'm using just the yolk, I don't get as much of that moisture. So that's where that water addition is going to help. But if I were to use a whole egg, the whites are primarily water. So, we get the protein still, but we'll probably use less whole eggs. So this recipe has 9 yolks in it, and like 30 grams of water. Now, if I were to switch this to just whole eggs, I would probably use 4 whole eggs, maybe 3 whole eggs. And then I can have flour on standby just in case, it's a little bit too wet. So here I'm just chopping in the egg to the flour, getting it kind of worked into so it's not super wet when I try to go knead it by hand. Trying to work in one area of my table. And I can see it starting to kind of come together. I'm going to use the bowl scraper to just get it brought together. Scrape it off from sticking to the table. And I'm going to start to just bring it together with my hands. Yes.
What type of flour are you using today and why?
So I'm using, like I said, the semolina flour and 00 flour. So there's 2 different textures going to be going on there. Our 00 flour is going to give it kind of a silkiness, a little bit softer of a consistency in the finished product. I'm going to grab my water. Need a little bit more, it's a little dry.
Would different kinds of flour depend on specified pastas?
Like, depending on like the specific type of pasta we're gonna make it up to.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I'm doing a blend today. If I were making just a straight cut noodle, say linguine, spaghettini, any heartier but like thinner noodle, I'd want to have a little bit more texture to the dough, so that when it's cooked, you still have that little bit of a bite. If I were to use just straight semolina flour for this dough today, we would see that it would have a little bit tougher of a consistency than we would want for a filled pasta, as well as our wide noodle, the pappardelle. So we want to make sure that we, pick a consistency or the type of flour so that it's relative to the noodle. And that today is, this blend. And this is something a recipe I've used quite often for, ravioli, tortellini, because it lets the dough be a little bit softer in the finished product. So here I'm just kneading it. You can see it's coming together now. I've pretty much picked up all the dry. It's a little dry, but I'm not too worried about that right now, because once we start, we get it kneaded together, the flour is going to hydrate. So the moisture from the yolks, the moisture from the water that we added, it's going to absorb into the flour, and you're going to notice after it rests that it becomes softer, that it's not as hard as it is right here, which is a good sign.
Can you over knead a dough?
Yeah, absolutely. This one, pasta, you want to knead it till it comes together and it holds shape, and you start to see it get smooth. If you over knead it in this beginning stage, it's just going to take a longer rest period afterwards. So today, like when I finish kneading this dough, I'm going to let it rest for about 30 minutes in the cooler. I'll wrap it up or put it into a Ziploc bag, place it into the cooler, and allow it to just relax. That allows the moisture to kind of absorb into the flour. It allows that gluten to relax, and allows it to become easier to roll out. Now, if I went straight from kneading it into the roller, I would roll it out, and I'd get it out onto the table, and it'd be the length I wanted, and I'd turn for a second, and I'd come back to it, and it would shrink up. And that's just the gluten just retracting back to itself. So it would just be a disservice, and twice the amount of work that it would take to really roll it out and get it ready. So I'm just going to knead it again, like I said, until it comes together, gives us a nice smooth surface, and then I'm going to get it ready to store. Now, this kneading technique is pretty straightforward. I'm pressing it down, turning it 90 degrees, folding it in half, and pressing it. And that's just working the gluten in different directions and developing it. The thing you have to look at there when you said about over kneading is we're also going to be running it through a pasta machine where it's stretching out the gluten. And I might turn it and run it through again another direction just to get it worked even more. So we're going to develop gluten even in the rolling process. Now, I didn't put any salt in my dough. Does anyone know why that might be? What do we do when we cook pasta?
Cook pasta, you salt the water, and you want to use that while cooking.
Yep, exactly. We're going to salt the water heavily. We want it to taste like the ocean, is what my chef told me at my previous job. We want to make sure that water tastes like the ocean. It's salty, because that's going to absorb into our noodle and give it the flavor that it needs. Salt is also going to kind of develop the gluten even more and a little bit stronger, and we don't really want to do that in this beginning stage. So it's not necessary. You can put salt in it. I don't. I never have. Some chefs will put oil in their dough as well. The oil helps to kind of tenderize the product. It allows it to add a little flavor. Some chefs will do like an olive oil, extra virgin olive oil into it. Here's our finished dough. It's smooth, it's pliable, it feels pretty good. I know once it rests, it'll feel even softer. So I don't want to worry too much about it right now, being too dry. So I'm just going to put it into a Ziploc bag. Be sure to label it. And I'm going to let this rest for 30 minutes and then come back to it, and it'll be ready to roll and turn into our dough. So now I just want to make sure I wipe up my table of any debris, scrape it up into my trash bin. I'll give it a quick wipe, that way we don't have any debris laying on the table as we're rolling our dough out.
Seth, I have a question.
Yeah.
Will the time you take to rest your pasta, does it depend on like the texture? Like if it was softer, would you let it rest like for a shorter amount of time?
No, I'm going to let it go for the standard 30 minutes, no matter what flour I'm using. In the case that it's, just a straight bread flour dough, which is appropriate to do, I would still rest it the same way. If I used all-purpose flour, I'd rest it the same amount of time. If I did whole wheat flour, I'd rest it the same amount of time. Just because that ensures that it's fully hydrated, it ensures that the gluten's completely rested, and it's at that final consistency that we want when we're rolling it through, and it makes it easier for us. Good question.
Would you use a different pasta recipe if you're doing filled or cut pasta?
Would I use a different recipe?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I would make sure that, if I'm doing a filled pasta, like I said, I want the dough to be a little bit more tender. One thing I experienced out in the industry and working with different types of dough when we're making, ravioli. We made ravioli every Tuesday at the restaurant. We used a straight 100% semolina flour dough. And what we found was we kept having trouble with the edges being too tough. Where the filling wasn't touching the dough, it was causing it to be more of like a tougher consistency. So when we kind of experimented and practiced with some different types, we found that having some semolina flour gave us that texture that we wanted, but still being able to cook at the same rate as like where the filling laid on the pasta. So you can use 100% semolina flour, absolutely. You just run into that, that risk in the cooking process where it might not match up. You might have it like two different donenesses going on. And that plays a lot into the rolling process as well. Where you have dough overlapping, obviously it's going to take a little bit longer to cook. So where it's a single layer of dough, it's going to be a little quicker. So getting your thickness of dough is really important in that process. So let me grab I have a dough that I made a little bit earlier that's been resting for over a half an hour, which is also very much an okay thing to do. I also have a little dusting flour for my table. This is just a mix of the 00 and semolina. If I had just the straight white flour for dusting, it might get a little gummy on the surface if I'm not careful about brushing it off. The semolina flour helps to also just add a little bit more texture to our dough by having it on there. Plus it breaks it up nice. So when I'm dusting my table, just like in the bake shop, which you learned, you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate amount. We're not just dropping a big old clump in the middle of the table and setting our dough down in it. We want to make sure that we're dusting and literally just dusting the table. You can barely even see the flour on the surface from where I'm standing, and you can see there's not that much, right? So now I want to make sure I get it to a proper thickness to get it started through my machine. So I'm going to use just a French rolling pin and begin to just get it to a thickness about, I'd say, 1/2 inch. And I want to try to make it square. Now, keeping it square is just the nice part for running it through this machine. Now I can fix that as I'm rolling the dough. So we're getting about there. So now I want to make sure that, I still have flour on the surface as well as on the table, and I want to begin rolling it. Any big buildups of flour, we want to make sure we dust off, or else it's going to make our dough a little gummy as we come through. So as you can see, it started out as a square, but now it's starting to get this oval shape. I'm going to run it through probably one more time at this setting 10, which is the widest setting. And then I'm going to come back through and I'm going to fold it in on itself a little bit, just to allow it to keep that square shape. And then I'll run it through a different direction. I'm going to grab my brush.
Chef,
Yes.
is there like a different way that you could roll out pasta instead of doing it by hand?
Yeah. Just with a rolling pin is a way of doing it. Not everyone has access to, a pasta roller. So running it with just a rolling pin is perfectly fine, where it may not get to the thinnest thickness that you want, but you can get it very, very close. It might just be a little bit more rustic pasta at that point. The nice thing about this machine is that you get that consistent thickness throughout. Of course, as you get better rolling doughs out, it's going to make it, a little bit easier as you go. So I moved down on this machine. There's a dial that has 10 settings. I'll start it out at 10, which is the widest setting, and then I move down and I run it through twice, and I'll move it down to 8. And I usually skip one number and move it down to number 8 and run it through twice, and then move down to 6, run it through twice, and I'm trying to get it all the way down to setting 2, which is going to get us to the thickness that we want for our filled pasta and for our pappardelle. We're going to do the same thickness for both. Since it is a larger noodle, I don't want it to be too thick because then it gets to be too much. So our sauce today is a ragu, and it has a lot to do, the shape that I'm making has a lot to do with that sauce in general. A ragu is a heartier meat sauce that's been slow cooked, so it stands up really well to a larger noodle or a filled pasta. Agnolotti, it goes really well with. The agnolotti we'll make today is going to be filled with a butternut squash and mascarpone filling, which would pair beautifully with this sauce. But for our finished dish today, we're just going to do the pappardelle with that, and then have a nice herb ricotta to top it with.
Chef, you go, Abby.
Who else was that? Abby. Go ahead.
Would you use different type of sauce for different style noodles?
Yeah. So like I said, today we're doing the ragu with these noodles because it's a heartier, thicker noodle that stands up to a big sauce. Where I would potentially, not want to serve this sauce with a spaghettini, where it's a really small noodle where it doesn't pair well with that heavy sauce. It'll weigh it down. If I'm doing a thinner noodle, I'm going to think more along the lines of a lighter sauce. So you have things like say you're doing an aglio olio, which is just an oil and garlic sauce, and you're trying to pair that with a noodle. I would go with something like linguine, where it has a little bit more texture to it than a spaghettini, but it pairs really, really well together. A spaghetti goes with your traditional smooth tomato sauce that's slow cooked, that everyone has had growing up. You may use a jarred sauce to eat it with your family. You may not make your own sauce at home. Good question. So I'm almost to the thickness we want. I got a couple more rolls to go through. And as I'm rolling it, I'm supporting the dough with my hand until it gets to pretty much ran through the whole way, because as you can see, it's going to start to get softer and more pliable, and I can easily put my fingertips through it if I flip my hands the wrong direction. So I rest it on the back of my hands so that I don't put my finger through it or cause any indents in the dough. So I'm down to my setting of 2, and what we're looking for is that we'll be able to see almost through the dough, see our hand on the back side of the dough as it comes out. Now, your grandmother may be rolling out the dough and they take a sheet of newspaper, put it underneath, and set the dough on top of it. If they can read the newspaper through it, then it's good to go. I'm not going to do that, but I know by just looking at it through my hand, or through like the dough, if I can see my hand through it, then we're at a good thickness. And I need about half of a step down to get to that point. Now, if it becomes too hard to manage, another way of doing this is by cutting it in half so that you can manage it through the machine a little bit easier. And this is just an Italian tool that I received. It's a brass pastry wheel. It has a fluted edge and a straight edge cutter. And it's great for doing like ravioli or agnolotti. You can cut into for tortellini. It's a
Chef,
universal tool. Go ahead.
do you need that tool to make pasta?
No. What else could we use in place of it?
A knife.
A knife, yeah, absolutely. You can use a knife. You can use a pasta wheel or a pastry wheel, pizza cutter. It's really, you don't have to use these tools to be successful. It does definitely help, but it's not absolutely required. Question again. Just like we don't have to use a pasta machine to roll out our dough. I'm just gonna do one more pass just to straighten this out a little bit. And then we'll get to building up our dough, or our pasta. So the first shape we're gonna work with is gonna be the agnolotti, and then we'll cut the pappardelle last, because it's really that's a really simple pasta to make up. We'll be utilizing our chef knife to cut it. Go ahead.
Does the amount of dusting affect the final result of the pasta, like the texture?
The dusting flour?
Yes.
Yeah, it will. It will play a huge impact on the final product if you're using too much. Especially in like our folded pasta when we start to make it up. If we leave a bunch of dusting flour on it on the inside where the filling might go, you'll taste it. You'll taste that kind of raw flour inside of it. It could cause it to become really gummy, especially on the outer surfaces. When we do the pappardelle, you'll see me dust it pretty good and then fold it up to cut it. That flour will come off in the water as we cook it because it's not going to be a huge amount. But you do have to be conscious of that fact that you could easily add too much flour and dry out your dough and cause it to be too dry, too tough, gummy, so on. We want to make sure we're keeping our dough covered as we're not working with it so that it doesn't dry out too quickly. With this recipe or this dough, it shouldn't too quick. We have a fair amount of time to work with it because it is a higher moisture. So I'm just getting a sheet ready. I'm going to do a few agnolotti just to show you how to make them up, and then we'll get the pappardelle cut. I have some water behind me boiling. We'll get it salted, and we'll get to making our finished product. I want to make sure I have a little bit of water just to seal our edge whenever we are building our agnolotti. I want to make sure I have my filling ready, which I do, already bagged up and cold. And what else do we need?
Jeff,
Go ahead.
if there was oil already in the dough, would you have to still use water?
If there was oil in the recipe of the dough?
Yes.
Yeah, you would still, I mean, adding the water is just to really ensure that you get a good seal on the dough once you add the filling. If it's a higher moisture dough where it's going to be kind of tacky and sticky and you don't have too much flour on it, you can almost guarantee it's going to seal. But just to have that kind of security measure to make sure that there's not going to be any errors there, it's just best to seal it with a little bit of water. You can use egg wash as well. It's really dependent on what you have or what you want to work with. So I'm just going to go ahead and brush off my flour from the dough that I'm working with. I do have a little bit of flour underneath it still, which is important because as I build this, it's going to take time and it might stick to the table. And then if it sticks to the table, then we have, problems there trying to make sure that, we get a nice finished product. I have a little tray with a cooling rack on it that we're going to put our finished pasta on to hold it until we go to cook it. This allows it to get a little bit of air around the outside, allows it to dry and tack up a little bit where we might want that. So for the agnolotti, like I said, it's called a little pillow. We're going to pipe our filling into a line into about 1-inch segments with a gap between each one, and you'll see why shortly after we get the filling in. So I'm coming about 1/2 of an inch in from the edge of the dough because we're going to fold it up on itself. Making sure that we get a nice finished edge. And I'm just going to, like I said, skip over. Trying to keep it nice and consistent in size. I'm going to go ahead and wet the edge of my dough that's going to fold up over. We're going to bring it up and over itself. And just begin to press with our fingertips right up against that filling. And I'm kind of tucking it as I go just to make sure that that filling's pressed all the way up against that back edge. Get it nice and sealed. Brush off any of that dusting flour that we had. And now I'm going to come through and pinch it with my fingertips in between the fillings. So I'm making almost like a little bonbon when you see it. Pressing out any air that might be in there as well. And then you're able to form it a little bit just to make sure that you get a nice uniform shape to it.
What would happen if you didn't press out all the air?
When it goes into the water, it could possibly burst. So that air in there will cause it to kind of expand, and then it causes it to pop, and then you have that busted filling. It's not the end of the world, but you want to try to get as much use out of your product as possible. So avoiding that is crucial. So now I'm going to take my fluted edge of my pasta wheel, and I'm going to cut straight along that line where I sealed it, putting enough pressure to make sure we're cutting through the dough. And there I have a nice strip. I'm going to go ahead and just do my next row as well, so that way we're just working in a consistent manner. Go ahead and wet that edge. You don't want to get it too wet. If you get it too wet, then it gets kind of hard to work with.
Chef,
Yeah.
is there a lot of scrap dough when making this kind of pasta?
There is a little bit, a lot less than if you're doing like a ravioli, but the scraps can be utilized if you don't let them dry out too much. This one we could actually incorporate it into our pappardelle if I left enough, a wide enough strip at the end, because it's about the length that we would make our pappardelle anyways. So I could potentially use it for that. You can kind of save up your scraps, wrap them up, and then rework them and just let them rest a little bit longer before utilizing them again. It can be used for another filled pasta, but you have to then think too that this dough's already been worked, so you don't want to work it too much. So here, cut this edge. All right, so now I have my agnolotti filled. I have it crimped and ready to cut. So the signature of this shape is that when you cut these crimped edges, that it folds up and kind of creates this little bit of a pocket. So I'm going to take the fluted edge of my pasta wheel and just cut straight through each one, in between each. There we go. Pressing down. So now I'm left with these beautiful little pillows or pockets that will take on the sauce and pick up the sauce and fill with the sauce. So we'll let those sit on our cooling rack here, drying rack. Nice and neat and organized. We'll turn our others, cut through them really quick. Yeah.
What are some other fillings that would work for this pasta?
Say that again.
What are some other fillings that would work for this pasta?
That's a good question. This pasta is nice. Same thing with ravioli is you can really get creative with your fillings. Traditional fillings for like a ravioli is a ricotta-based filling. Just ricotta cheese seasoned with Parmesan, salt, pepper, and fresh herbs. This filling that I made, like I said, is a roasted butternut squash with mascarpone and sage. I just thought it would pair very well with our sauce choice today. But you could do a meat filling. We could do this braised short rib, make it into a filling for our agnolotti or our ravioli or our tortellini, and use that as just the filling, and then change up our sauce. That would go well with a brown butter sage sauce. Just keeping it very simple, and that's the kind of the cool thing about Italian cuisine is the ability to create these pastas and kind of make them their own. Every region in Italy has its own, its shape that it's known for, or sauce type that it's known for. You get along the coast in Italy, it's going to be a lot more seafood based, di mares, or of the ocean, of the sea, and you have a lot more lighter tomato sauces with a lot of fresh seafood, or citrus based flavors within the final product. So there's our agnolotti. I'm going to go ahead and just get wiped down for a quick, to get my cutting board up onto the counter here. And we'll get our ingredients ready for our topping, and then we'll cut our pappardelle. I'm just going to take a damp towel that was damped in our sanitizer to keep my cutting board secure. ahead and place this down on my speed rack just to get it out of the way for now. I'm going to bring up my ingredients for my filling, or for our topping, I should say. I've got some fresh herbs here. I have a little bit of fresh chive, some flat leaf parsley, and some oregano. So I'm just going to get those ready to be minced up. They're all pre-washed and ready to go. So I want to make sure I bring my knife out. And again, we're using a knife. We practice this quite often, but just to reinforce it, want to make sure that we're safely using it, that we are being careful. So making sure we have a proper grip on our knife, and make sure that we keep our guide hand ready. So just coming through the chives, I'm just going for a fine cut on it. This is just all going to be mixed into our ricotta filling. I keep saying filling, but I mean topping. Yes.
Is the filling already pre-made?
The filling was pre-made. The topping I'm making currently. So this is just going to be like a fresh herb and ricotta topping that has salt, pepper, oregano, parsley, and chive. So I want to make sure I'm mincing up my fresh herbs so that there's not large chunks in our finished product. And I'm just rocking the knife back and forth while pinched in between my fingers. Using my guide hand now on top of my knife. And I have the ricotta on ice right now in a little 6-pan. I'm just going to go ahead and add my herbs right to it. Gather up any of the extra that didn't quite get picked up that first run. Bring this out. Making sure that we wipe down and sanitize our knife before we put it back. Also, while picking up any excess herbs from our cutting board, so when we bring our pappardelle up to cut, that we don't pick up any of the herb in the dough, which would just cause some discoloration. Keeping a nice clean workstation as we go. And I'm just going to wipe off my knife. Tippy cleaned it later. Place it back on our tray. Now we're going to bring over our sheets of dough that we rolled out already that just need to be cut for our pappardelle. Right? So we'll come back to our filling and season it here shortly. I want to go ahead and just get this pappardelle cut so that we can get it into the water and cooked. So I do need my chef knife again. So when you're doing pappardelle, since it's a hand cut noodle, we just want to make sure we dust the top where it's going to come in contact with itself again. Again, I don't have a lot of flour on there. So then I'm just going to kind of roll it on itself, like so, and leave it in a little bundle there. And we're going to take our next piece, and this one, the length I want is going to be about this width. So this is actually folded in half. So what I'm going to do is cut it on that seam where it was folded with my knife. And then what we can do with this is dust this bottom sheet. Lay our sheet on top of it, dust it. and then roll it up the same way we did that first sheet. And now you may say, like, you brushed off all that flour from previous times, but this, when you're cutting it and stacking it like it is, we want to make sure you have enough flour to keep it from sticking to itself. So then we want to take, and like I said, this is a very wide noodle. It's about an inch in diameter when we cut it. So I'm just going to take my guide hand and cut straight down through as carefully as possible. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on the knife as I'm cutting through the dough, because if I do that, you might crimp the dough together and getting that kind of clumped pasta to it. So just kind of glide my knife through. I'm not worried about trimming up the edges. Like I said, it's a very rustic shape. This one's a little bit wide, so I am going to trim off that end and just add it to my scrap pile. And now I have these nice big wide flat noodles. Right? So you may want to loosen them up just to make sure that they're not sticking, and dust them together with some flour. You can lay them up on their side and kind of give them a little bit of a dusting, because once we put them into our water, we're going to make sure we loosen them up in the water so that they don't clump together when we're cooking it. Okay. And like we had this dough sitting off to the side there where it was starting to dry itself, so it shouldn't stick too badly together. So we're going to take our little bundles of pappardelle, place them on our rack here. And we're going to go ahead and cook our pappardelle. We're going to go ahead and get rid of our cutting board. I believe I am finished up with it. Place it down on my speed rack. Bring up my sanitizer rag. I'm going to get everything kind of situated so that we're successful in our cooking. I'm going to move everything back here to our pot of water. I'm finished with my dusting flour. Put it away. Finished with our pasta wheel. We're finished with our agnolotti filling. And we do still need to finish seasoning our ricotta, so I'll come back to that in a second while the pasta's cooking. Go ahead and clean off my knife, keeping the sharp edge away from us when cleaning the knife. Clean off our handle. Brush off any excess flour on the machine down onto the table so that we can pick it up. I'm going to use my bench scraper just to get any of the flour picked up so I don't grab off the towel. Any questions up to this point?
Chef,
Yeah.
for the pasta that you make, would it take longer for it to be in the water?
To cook?
Yeah, to cook. Sorry.
It's going to take probably about the same amount of time. Even though it's wider, it's still the same thickness as another fresh pasta. Now, where you see a considerable difference in the cook time is between dried and fresh pasta. So dried pasta, there's all the moisture's removed from it. And that dough is actually just semolina flour and water. That's pushed through a machine. It can also be made by hand, but typically it's pushed through a machine and has no egg in it at all. Then it's allowed to air dry. This pasta has the egg in it, so to dry it, it's a little bit, less. You see that less often. You see this more along the lines of frozen to be stored. So that's what we would do at the restaurant. We would make our pasta. It would be an egg dough, and then we would portion it to the size per order and keep it frozen, which keeps it for, as long as the temperature's kept consistent, it allows it to last for quite a while. You can also keep it in the refrigerator, but it's not going to last nearly as long. So I'm going to bring back my mise en place for my filling, or topping. Again, here I go. I'm going to add a little pinch of salt to my ricotta, some fresh cracked black pepper, and I'm just going to mix it up. And we'll come back to plating this once it's all comes together. So this is pretty much ready to go. We have our filling, or our topping. I keep saying filling. I also have a little bit of fried sage that we're going to add just as like a textural component to our finished dish. Our water's pretty much boiling. I'm going to take my salt. And this is probably about the amount that we want to use in this amount of water. Get it nice and salty so that dough absorbs that salt and really takes on that flavor. We're going to take our beef short rib filling. I'm going to take some tongs over as well. I'm using a non-stick pan, so I want to make sure I'm not using direct contact with metal. I'm going to add in my sauce and allow it to start to warm up. And that's a bit much. We'll cut back a little bit. And I'm going to wait to start heating it until after I'm ready to pull my pasta out. I don't want to trip the breaker or anything over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in my noodle, but as I'm adding it in, I want to make sure I separate it. Breaking it up as it goes in, while also giving it a nice stir. So we're going to let that go for about 2 to 3 minutes until the pasta's nice and al dente. I'm going to take that time to go wash my hands really quick. So once I pull this pasta out of the water, it's going to be ready to go right into the sauce. And with this sauce, since it's a heavier, kind of chunkier sauce, we want to make sure we get some moisture into it. So we're going to use pasta water from our pot that we're cooking it in, because that's going to add that salt. It's going to add some starch from the pasta as it cooks, and it's going to bring that sauce together and give it a nice glossy consistency. So I'm going to say, from the looks of things here, that the pasta is pretty much done. It's got a lot softer. It's holding up nice. So I'm going to go ahead and lift it. And like I said, I'm okay with it coming out and being, still wet. Because, like I said, we're going to add that into our pot anyway, or pan anyways. A couple more noodles here to help. Let it drain off a little bit. Go ahead and get this heated up. You can add a little bit of water, butter to this sauce as well while you're heating it. It's going to add a nice fattiness to it while adding a nice flavor as well. I have a ladle over here just to bring some water into our sauce. We want to make sure we bring it up to temp. And you want to be careful when handling these fresh noodles, because if you're not careful in tossing it with the sauce, you might break them up. And you want to avoid that at all costs. We'll bring our plate up. Bring a side towel over to set our hot pan on to keep the table from sucking out the heat.
Chef,
Yeah.
could you overcook the pasta after you cook it in the water and you saute it then?
Absolutely. Yeah, I always pull my pasta out of the water slightly under al dente, just so that, because I know that I'm going to heat it into the sauce that it's going to be served with. So I'm going to make sure that, I finish that cooking process in the pan, as well as, knowing that it's not completely finished anyways. But yeah, you can absolutely, lose track and, end up overcooking it because you had too much moisture in the sauce and you're trying to cook it down and make it a little better consistency. So you really want to make sure you account for that in this process. Smells really good. It's too bad you can't smell it out there. I'm just trying to break up some of the meat in the sauce so that it coats. And I'm not adding a lot of water at any given time. I'm just adding it as I see it starts to dry up a little, because I know I want to make sure I get it nice and loose for to coat the pasta. I'm going to let it bubble all the way into the center of our pan. I'm going to bring it over. It's good and hot. See, it's steaming nice. And we're going to go ahead and get it into the plate. So this is enough for multiple people to eat. I do have some behind the scenes help here that are going to enjoy it. But I'm going to go ahead and plate one portion of it for everyone to see what our finished product came to be. And I like to do just a little twirl with the tongs. Plate it right into the center of the plate. And I can always come back and grab some of the sauce if I don't get enough in this first plate up. And spoon it over. Or plate it a little bit extra. Like I said, this is a tighter, heartier sauce that you're gonna see. And we're gonna take our ricotta filling, just dry it off so that the water that it was sitting in, the ice that it was sitting in doesn't drip into our finished product. We're gonna take and do a little nice quenelle of this ricotta cheese mixture right up on top. So I just have 2 spoons here. We'll do a quick quenelle. Place it right down on top. We'll hit it with a couple of these nice fried sage leaves. The frying of the sage leaf really makes it crispy, and it doesn't really overpower it. Some people get a little nervous when they see fried sage on something, but it really just adds a nice texture and a nice little pop of flavor. So we have our finished pappardelle with beef short rib ragu and herb ricotta right on top. And I would probably in the restaurant hit that with a little extra virgin olive oil right before it goes out to the table, just to give it that nice shine on top of that ricotta. Okay. So just to do a little bit of a review with you, going back and looking at what we did, what can you tell me about flour choice with our choice of doughs or pasta makeup?
Depends what kind of pasta you're making and what the product is. If it's like a ravioli, you would use like semolina and bread flour, 50-50. And then I forget the name of this certain pasta.
Agnolotti or pappardelle?
Pappardelle, you would use 75% semolina and then
some double zero.
double zero, and then the rest of that would be semolina flour.
Yep. Now, if I were doing just a straight linguine cut, what could we do to change it up? Could we still use that same formula?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You can. It lends well to really any shape, but if you're really getting into the details of it, you want to really focus on that quality of the dough. So if you want a toothier, more al dente texture to your pasta, you would use that semolina flour, which is a coarser, harder wheat that gives you that consistency and that texture. But if you're looking to have a silkier, softer dough, then you want to go with a more refined flour like a double zero. And I didn't really talk too much about why it's called double zero, but in Italian flours, there's zero, double zero, A and B ground. Double zero is referring to the fact that it's ground very, very fine, almost like a talcum powder consistency. Zero is going to be a little bit coarser, so the bran might show up a little bit more. And then as you go higher, into the A's and B's, it's going to be a lot less refined flour, getting into like your whole wheats and different things like that. We could absolutely make this dough into a whole wheat pasta by substituting out our part of our white flour, our double zero flour, for whole wheat. I was looking into and kind of just seeing if you could do like a sourdough pasta, where you use a sourdough starter into the mix, and some people are actually doing it, which is interesting. It would add just another layer of flavor to our finished dish. So in review, you don't absolutely have to have a pasta machine to be able to make handmade pasta at home. A rolling pin and a knife is really all you need, and that's what's beautiful about it. There are hundreds of shapes that can be made by hand as well as by machine, and that's what's really neat about pasta making, and kind of where I found my passion for it. It's just the variety that you can create from such a simple amount of products: eggs, flour, even water and flour. So I want to thank you all for joining me here for this demonstration, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you.